This famous meeting scene aboard the first Death Star in Star Wars A New Hope is known in Star Wars canon as the Joint Chiefs, but originally in Star Wars Legends it was referred to as the Imperial General Staff. However, members of the meeting changed throughout the Empire's reign. But who were all the Imperial officers serving within the Emperor's inner military circle? Join me over the next few minutes as I review all the canon-named members of the Galactic Empire's military Joint Chiefs, from various sources including the 2024 novel The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire. In Star Wars Legends there doesn't appear to be any named characters other than the Imperial officers seen in the Death Star conference room meeting when checking source material. If you know of any names mentioned in Legends, either before or after A New Hope, then let me know in the comments. So what was the Joint Chiefs? Well, it was a military meeting of high-ranking Imperial officers who were specifically appointed to represent various branches and departments of the Imperial military war machine. Over its 20-year existence, these parts of the Empire were represented including the Imperial Navy branches, the Imperial Army branches, and supported by Comp Nor and its sub-intelligence agency, Imperial Intelligence and Imperial Security Bureau, and for a time Naval Intelligence. Although not officially called a meeting of the Joint Chiefs in canon, this scene set in 18 BBY is the earliest version of the Joint Chief members, which the following characters would eventually become appointed to. The first is Grand Moff Wilhoff Tarkin. As the most senior and chair of the meeting throughout almost its entire history, the Grand Moff held extensive oversight over Imperial funding to military projects and was the closest to Emperor Palpatine himself. Tarkin remained the chair of the Joint Chiefs at the very heart of the Empire's vast military machine until his death in 0 BBY. General Hurst Ramodi was a veteran military officer of the Clone Wars and a close ally and friend to Tarkin. Ramodi and Tarkin were the only two members in this list which remained a permanent fixture throughout the majority of the time of the Joint Chiefs. Admiral Barton Coburn was another Clone Wars veteran and a very senior officer in the Empire in 18 BBY. However, his sympathy for the clone troopers was not aligned with the Empire's short and long-term goals of phasing out the troopers, and was later replaced by Admiral Antonio Motti to represent the Imperial Navy. Commander Orson Krennic held the highly important Project Stardust, which was early in the process of construction along with the energy weapon development using kyber crystals. Krennic was only too happy to provide an update to the attendees. Dr. Royce Hemlock was the chief scientist of the Advanced Science Division. The Doctor provided an update on his important work towards the cloning program using clones as test subjects, stating the science project was of great importance to the Emperor. He was backed by Tarkin when Ramodi and Coburn challenged the validity of the project. Hemlock's appearance on the Joint Chiefs as a science officer was short, as he was killed in the same year when his base at Mount Tantiss was largely destroyed. Over time, the Joint Chief members changed constantly against the Empire's challenges and even deaths of appointed individuals. By 17 BBY, the Joint Chiefs was an official meeting of the highest military officers. With so much power and influence, they were able to set military policy and strategy. Some of the most brutal Imperial decisions against the galaxy were decided in these meetings, usually between the Imperial Navy, Army and Intelligence branches. In 14 BBY there were a number of new appointments that were made to increase the numbers of the meeting, and joined in particular Tarkin and Ramodi, as well as replacing some of the aging or deceased officers. Rear Admiral Conan Antonio Motti was appointed as Chief of the Imperial Navy and held the most influence over naval policy and strategy, as well as being a strong ally to Tarkin's objectives. Motti was one of the Empire's most powerful chiefs until his death in 0 BBY. Vice Admiral Talatz was also appointed as a naval chief, but was less influential at the meetings and subservient to Motti. Rear Admiral Tien de Gerard was also appointed as another naval chief. His cold personality and lack of ambition attracted the attention of the Emperor, so much so that de Gerard rose up the ranks to later become a Moff and lead the construction of the second Death Star. Admiral Nil Tennant, an old friend to Tarkin during the Clone Wars, he was personally appointed to the Joint Chiefs. As a naval chief, he was a competent officer who craved the favour of the Emperor, and sometimes irritated Tarkin. Rear Admiral Kendall Ozzel, he was a pompous and arrogant officer who was appointed in 14 BBY as another junior naval chief to Admiral Motti. Ozzel also had a second spell on the Joint Chiefs between 0 ABY and 3 ABY. Appointed as the Joint Chief of the Imperial Army, General Cassio Tague, like Motti, was another very powerful Imperial during most of the Empire's reign. When the first Death Star was destroyed at the Battle of Yavin in 0 BBY, Tague was investigating the abandoned rebel base on Dantooine and luckily survived the destruction of the battle station and his fellow Joint Chief members' fate. Armand Isard was the director of Comp Nor, and appointed as the most senior intelligence chief when in attendance at the Joint Chief meetings, usually held on Coruscant as its headquarters. Isard was also the chairperson at Comp Nor's Select Committee meetings. As the deputy director of the Imperial Security Bureau, Horace Eisen was a regular intelligence chief in attendance. However, later that year Eisen received a promotion to Imperial Intelligence. For his promotion, his intelligence work had successfully provided evidence of a communication cache that had uncovered a plot to incapacitate the Imperial holonet. Colonel Wolf Yularen was appointed in 14 BBY as another Imperial Security Bureau representative, and remained as a long-standing member of the Joint Chiefs until his death at the Battle of Yavin. The Joint Chiefs position representing naval intelligence was shared between Vice Admiral Rancid and Vice Admiral Terranul Screed. However, their appointments were cut short when the Naval Intelligence Agency lost its independence and was transitioned back into Imperial Intelligence after a number of underwhelming blunders. In 10 BBY following the Mimban campaign, General Aya Falk was appointed as a junior Imperial Army representative on the Joint Chiefs. It seems to me, having listed these earlier appointments, it would have been impossible for all of them to be present at the meetings due to assignments, projects or missions, so it seems plausible Tarkin would have selected the members who he needed to be present to discuss specific matters when required. Director Orson Krennic had remained a member of the Joint Chiefs throughout its existence while leading on Project Stardust. Rising to the title of Director of Advanced Weapons Research, he attended his last meeting when Krennic vigorously reaffirmed the battle station's destructive power. However, in 1 BBY the director was killed by his own creation when the Death Star fired upon the base at Scarif, where the battle station's technical plans were stolen. The famous Death Star conference scene in Star Wars A New Hope in 1977 is our only actual official showing of the Joint Chiefs. With the Death Star battle station now at the heart of the Imperial military strategy, the appointed members in 0 BBY had changed significantly. To make the meeting strategically functional as the Imperial military chief, it meant the Joint Chiefs had to be moved to the Death Star from its usual headquarters on Coruscant. It was an opportunity to shake up the attendees by appointing even more trusted allies, like Major Seward Cass, who acted as a junior aide to Tarkin aboard the Death Star as the communications chief. Another old friend and still appointed was General Hurst Ramodi. Although less influential than he once was, his role was the battle station operations chief and adjutant to Tarkin. Major General Muradmin Bast served as the Death Star's chief manager and senior aide to Tarkin. Appointed as an aide to Cassio Tague, General Trek Moloch was appointed as the Imperial Army chief, but again was less influential than the other more senior Imperials around the table. Colonel Wolf Yularen was another long-standing ally to Tarkin, who remained appointed as the favoured Imperial Security Bureau representative to lead the intelligence operatives aboard the station and maintain loyalty to the Empire. Motti as another close ally to Tarkin, and Tague, who was not so close, both continued to be the most senior attendees apart from Tarkin himself. Of course, Darth Vader was a loose member of the Joint Chiefs, however rarely attended and generally kept his distance from the meetings due to the squabbling and bureaucratic reasons. However, we saw Vader in A New Hope accompanying Tarkin aboard the station as the Emperor's emissary, but quickly lost patience with Motti, whose overconfidence nearly got him killed by the Dark Lord. What follows next, as we know, is the rebel Luke Skywalker manages to achieve the very thing Cassio Tague feared, and exploits the identified exhaust port weakness, which destroys the station, and kills all the Joint Chiefs still on board the station excluding Tague and Ramodi, who both left the station by the time of the battle. In the aftermath of the station's destruction, the loss of nearly all the appointed Joint Chiefs, including Tarkin, inflicted a serious blow to the Imperial military. Left leaderless and without a senior officer of the Imperial military, Emperor Palpatine promoted Cassio Tague to the rank of Grand General and appointed him to the title of Supreme Commander of the Imperial military to replace Tarkin and also chair of the Joint Chiefs. Immediately Tague appointed several top-ranking army and naval officers, which remained after the huge loss of officers after the Battle of Yavin. In 0 ABY, Jared Montferrat, who was a naval admiral, became an influential and pragmatic officer who considered himself a guardian of the Imperial legacy. Montferrat was eventually killed during the Battle of Endor in 4 ABY. Also in 0 ABY as a rear admiral, The experienced Kendall Ozzel was reappointed to bolster a smaller and renewed group of Joint Chiefs. Ozzel was promoted by Tague to Fleet Admiral to command the Death Squadron until his death in 3 ABY, when he was force-choked by Darth Vader for making too many strategic mistakes. Vice Admiral Corf Furno was a naval officer from Grand Admiral Thrawn's 7th Fleet. An experienced senior fleet commander, Furno was appointed by Tague in 0 ABY. The Vice Admiral continued to be a member of the Joint Chiefs even after Tague's death. However, in 5 ABY, after the Empire's collapse, the Admiral was captured and interrogated by the New Republic after he surrendered attempting to defend the Kuat drive yards as the Empire continued to lose control over the galaxy. After bolstering the Joint Chiefs and successfully dealing with pirate attacks to Imperial shipping lanes, Vader was subsequently promoted to Supreme Commander of the Imperial military. Tague was eventually force-choked in 0 ABY by Darth Vader after Tague's demotion. In 4 ABY, 3 officers were appointed by Darth Vader to continue a small version of the Joint Chiefs. Fleet Admiral Firmus Piet, who replaced Kendall Ozzel as the senior officer of the Death Squadron, was appointed, but his membership was short as Piet was killed at the Battle of Endor in the same year. Admiral Ray Sloane joined Piet and fought at the Battle of Endor under Piet's command. Although Sloane survived the battle and outlived what was left of the Joint Chiefs, later Sloane was a member of the splintered Imperial remnant equivalent group called the Shadow Council, which consisted of the highest-ranking Imperials which remained after the fall of Palpatine's rule. It is not exactly clear when General Maximilian Veers joined the group. However, Star Wars lore seems to suggest that Darth Vader appointed him after he killed Tague. Vader felt the general was a brilliant tactician and also cool and efficient. General Aya Falk returned to be appointed as another Imperial Army representative, and later a senior commanding officer of the Imperial Army forces on the surface of Endor. Prior to the Battle of Endor, the Joint Chiefs was a less effective and cohesive group, as fragmented smaller groups took place which caused tension and often confusion between senior officers. After the Battle of Endor, the Joint Chiefs was replaced by the Shadow Council, which essentially acted in the same way, however the leadership and lineup had changed once again. As always, thanks for watching.